It started with a simple, defiant act. A small, handmade sign planted firmly in the earth that declared two powerful words: Not HOA. It was a boundary, a protest, and a promise all at once. For years, the line separating private land from the jurisdiction of neighborhood tyranny had been blurred, but this sign drew it in concrete. The instant that sign went up, the temperature in the community dropped. The self-appointed neighborhood Karen saw it not as a legal boundary, but as a personal declaration of war. Her response wasn't a fine or a nasty letter. It was a frantic phone call, straight to law enforcement, leveling the unbelievable accusation that a property owner was trespassing on their own land. The ultimate question: who exactly was going to pay the price for this massive overreach? The property itself was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary carved out of the suburban sprawl. It sat on an oversized, triangular lot, a peculiar parcel of land that jutted out into the otherwise uniform grid of the Pebble Creek Estates community. For the owner, this slight irregularity was exactly the appeal. It represented a quiet piece of independence, a place where the air felt a little freer and the rules a little more flexible. The entire appeal of the neighborhood was its tidy, well-maintained streets and quiet efficiency, a place where people generally kept to themselves, respecting the subtle, unwritten rules of community living. The main character was someone who had poured years of sweat equity into the land. They weren't fighting the system. They simply wanted to be left alone to cultivate their small piece of peace. Their activities were the kind of minor, wholesome projects that make a home feel lived in. Perhaps tending a slightly wilder patch of native plants than the manicured lawns next door, or dedicating a specific corner of the yard to storing salvaged materials for future home projects. These were not acts of defiance, merely the quiet persistence of a homeowner devoted to their space. For years, this balance held. The community's governing body, the HOA board, was a distant, bureaucratic hum, a necessary evil that collected fees and occasionally issued mild warnings about trash cans or mailbox paint. The true drama, however, lay not with the board, but with a specific, deeply vested neighbor. A woman whose retirement had seemingly turned into a full-time, self-appointed position as the community's chief enforcer. Let's call her the enforcer. She lived for structure, order, and the meticulous application of every single minute HOA bylaw. Her property was immaculate, and she expected the same surgical precision from everyone else. The stage was set on the narrowest point of the triangular lot, the place where the property line dissolved almost invisibly into the pristine, common area grass that technically belonged to the HOA. This section had always been ambiguous, and for years this ambiguity was an unspoken truce. But the enforcer, obsessed with a desire to bring all things into her definition of order, began to see that vague boundary as a direct affront to her authority. The protagonist's small, perfectly permissible patch of native flowering weeds, or perhaps a newly placed small storage shed position slightly too close to what she perceived as the edge, started to grate on her. The protagonist believed they were following the Plat Map and the law. They believed they were outside the official HOA boundary line, a quiet, crucial detail that had been overlooked for years. But the enforcer, obsessed with the aesthetics of her view, was about to force the issue, turning a simple disagreement over a few feet of earth into a full-blown war over who truly owned the ground they stood on. The quiet life was about to be shattered by an escalating series of demands that would eventually force the protagonist to make a highly visible, public statement of defiance. The subtle discomfort soon curdled into full-blown harassment. It began not with a loud confrontation, but with the silent, insidious delivery of official paperwork. The main character returned from a day of work to find the first HOA violation notice taped starkly to their front door. It wasn't a warning about loud parties or neglected maintenance. The offense was bizarrely specific: the placement of a small, decorative bird feeder, allegedly violating a clause about non-approved freestanding yard structures. It was an absurd claim, a targeted attack given that identical bird feeders dotted a dozen other properties in the community. The protagonists didn't panic. They simply corrected the issue, moving the feeder a few feet back toward the house. They believed that satisfying the specific complaint would end the matter. But this was merely the first volley in a targeted campaign orchestrated by the enforcer. She hadn't been satisfied with a simple fix. She wanted complete compliance, or better yet, total submission. The next notice arrived within the week, this time citing a turf violation. The small patch of native ground cover near the property line was deemed non-compliant with the uniformity standard for lawns. This was where the first seed of real defiance was planted. The homeowner carefully reviewed the HOA documents. They found the language vague, discretionary, and clearly being weaponized. The fines started small, $50, then $100, accumulating with frightening speed. Each fine wasn't just a loss of money. It was an expenditure of emotional energy, forcing the protagonist to spend hours of their precious free time crafting reasoned, documented rebuttals to clearly petty complaints. The irony was the HOA's stated purpose was to enhance community value, yet its only clear effect was to drain the protagonist's reserves. The situation accelerated when the enforcer began using technology to her advantage. She wasn't just walking the block. She was systematically documenting every perceived flaw with time-stamped, zoomed-in photographs. A misplaced trash bin lid, a slightly overgrown edge of pavement, a contractor's truck parked momentarily too close to the property line. Each transgression, no matter how minor or fleeting, resulted in another piece of official, threatening mail, created a constant, gnawing anxiety. The protagonist felt as if they were under continuous surveillance. Leaving the house became a performance. Returning home meant bracing for another official notification, and the quiet enjoyment of their own property evaporated. The most egregious escalation occurred when the focus shifted back to the ambiguous boundary line on the triangular lot. The enforcer had gone to the HOA board, a body she heavily influenced, and secured a vote to re-establish official markers on the communal green space. The HOA then sent a landscaping crew, unannounced, to trim back the protagonist's plants and erect a small, low-lying chain fence, a physical, undeniable claim to a few critical feet of land that the protagonist knew belonged to their deed. This was no longer about a bird feeder. It was about the erosion of property rights. The sight of the fence sent a surge of fury through the protagonist, replacing the weariness. This act of trespass by the association itself demanded a legal response. The homeowner had previously assumed the HOA was simply annoying, but now they suspected something far more deliberate, a bureaucratic land grab. They spent weeks immersed in old plat maps, deed restrictions, and zoning ordinances. The late-night research, illuminated by the harsh light of their laptop, revealed the crucial detail. A specific historical survey that explicitly designated those few critical feet of land as belonging to the protagonist's parcel, placing it decisively outside the official HOA boundary line. It was a quiet victory, a truth buried deep in forgotten archives, and it exposed the enforcer's entire campaign as fundamentally flawed, perhaps even malicious. But simply sending a certified letter would be lost in the bureaucratic void. The protagonist knew that to stop the harassment and reclaim their peace, they couldn't just whisper the truth. They had to shout it. The message had to be clear, undeniable, and impossible for the enforcer to ignore, hide, or dismiss. This is what led to the final, necessary, and provocative action. With a deep sense of justified defiance, the protagonist crafted a large, professional, weatherproof sign. Not a rude sign, not a threat, but a simple, factual declaration based on legal precedent and historical documents. They walked to the newly erected, temporary chain fence, tore it down, and in its place, hammered the new sign into the exact spot where their property line officially began. The simple, declarative text read, "Not in HOA jurisdiction, PR deed restriction and County Plat Map." The tension instantly became a live wire. The community had watched the drama quietly unfold, but this sign was a public, physical challenge to the enforcer's absolute authority. It was a direct, visual confirmation that she had been wrong, petty, and perhaps illegally invading private property. The response was immediate, predictable, and wildly beyond any reasonable action. The enforcer, losing her grip on the situation, skipped the formality of a fine, ignored the legitimacy of the legal documents cited, and went straight to the ultimate escalation, believing her authority was absolute. She called the police. She stood at the edge of the protagonist's property, pointing furiously at the legally placed sign, and made the shocking claim that the owner of the land was trespassing on common area property. The protagonist watched the flashing blue and red lights arrive, a surreal, horrifying culmination of months of petty harassment, all because of a small patch of dirt and a woman's desperate need for control. The police arrival transformed a civil dispute into a criminal situation, creating a cliffhanger that left the fate of the protagonist and the ownership of their peace. Hanging in the balance, the scene was pure, escalating chaos, a civil war on a postage stamp of suburban lawn. Two uniformed officers, their presence immediately lending a gravity and seriousness the situation didn't deserve, stood between the homeowner and the enforcer. The flashing blue lights painted the manicured hedges and the bold, new, "Not in HOA" sign in a stark, unsettling rhythm. The enforcer, fueled by adrenaline and the belief that the police were there to enforce her version of order, was already speaking in rapid-fire, accusatory tones. She pointed wildly, not just at the sign, but at the homeowner, leveraging the very language of the law she was abusing. "They are trespassing. This is common property. They destroyed the HOA marker and illegally erected that sign. You need to remove them and cite them for property damage." Her voice was shrill, demanding instant compliance, intoxicated by the perceived authority of the officer's arrival. The homeowner, however, was calm, a stillness born of months of quiet preparation. All the frustration, the targeted fines, the surveillance, and the anxiety had been channeled into one decisive counterweapon: truth. They stood their ground, not in aggression, but in quiet, absolute certainty. They didn't argue the definition of turf uniformity or the placement of a bird feeder. They spoke directly to the legal reality of the land. One of the officers, clearly weary of neighborhood disputes but obligated to investigate a claim of trespassing, finally turned to the homeowner, an official look of skepticism on his face. "Sir, can you explain why you removed the association's marker and placed a sign on what they claim is common property?" This was the moment, the turning point. The homeowner reached into a slim, prepared folder, not a messy binder of angry emails, but a carefully organized portfolio of facts. They handed the officer 2 sheets of paper. The first was a copy of their official property deed, highlighted precisely where the boundary line was described. The second was the County Plat Map, stamped and officially recorded, showing the precise, surveyed location of their triangular lot. Crucially, the map showed a clear, undeniable gap between the property line and the established, platted boundary of the Pebble Creek Estates HOA. The officer's demeanor shifted immediately. His job was to enforce the law, and the law was contained in those documents, not in the shrill demands of a neighbor. He stopped listening to the enforcer, who continued her indignant monologue about aesthetics and rules, and instead focused intently on the official county stamp. The silence from the protagonist was their most powerful argument. What followed was a slow, agonizing public humiliation for the enforcer. The officer, after a minute of careful cross-referencing the plat map with the physical location of the new sign, stood up straight, turning his back completely on the furious neighbor. He looked directly at the homeowner and spoke in a clear, non-negotiable tone. "According to this official map, sir, this ground you are standing on, and where your sign is placed, is legally outside the jurisdiction of the Pebble Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Your sign is legally placed on private property. There is no trespass violation here." The air went thick with tension. The enforcer's jaw dropped. Her face, flushed crimson with self-righteous anger moments before, went utterly white. Her entire campaign, the fines, the surveillance, the land grab, was based on a lie, a flawed assumption of authority over ground that was never hers to govern. She sputtered, trying to cite the HOA bylaws, but the officer cut her off with a single, sharp sentence. "Ma'am, the HOA bylaws are a civil contract. They do not supersede state property law or county plat maps." The officer then made a critical decision that sealed the enforcer's fate. Recognizing the situation as targeted, petty harassment disguised as a criminal complaint, the officer issued a firm warning that any further calls regarding the sign or the property line would be considered filing a false police report, a clear abuse of law enforcement resources. The officers turned, their lights still flashing, and left the scene with efficiency. They didn't need to arrest the enforcer. they had done something far more damaging. They had stripped her of her perceived power in the most public, undeniable way possible. The protagonist watched the tail lights disappear, feeling an overwhelming rush of vindication and a profound sense of relief. But the story wasn't over. The enforcer, defeated and utterly exposed, stood alone in the dimming light, staring at the sign that was now a monument to her failure. The quiet hum of the neighborhood felt heavy, judgmental. The confrontation was over, but the consequences had just begun. The legal victory was secured, but the cost, the permanent breakdown of community peace and the possibility of future, darker retaliation, now hung over the property like a shadow. The protagonist had won the battle for their land, but they were now an island in a sea of organized suburban resentment. The silence that followed the police departure was heavier, more charged than any of the shouting. The blue and red strobes vanished, taking the immediate threat of criminal charges with them, but leaving behind a far more damning truth. The enforcer stood motionless, abandoned by the very authority she had tried to conscript. Her absolute certainty had been publicly dismantled by a simple piece of paper, the official County Plat Map. She had mistaken arbitrary influence for actual power, and the entire neighborhood, those who had silently suffered her dictates, and those who had quietly encouraged her actions, knew it. The sign, previously the focus of her fury, now stood as an undeniable monument to her colossal error. For the protagonist, the immediate rush of vindication gave way to the exhausting necessity of securing the victory. The battle with the police was merely the final shot. The war with the bureaucracy had yet to conclude. The homeowner knew they could not rely on the officer's warning alone. They had to convert their public triumph into an unassailable, recorded fact within the association's own history. A comprehensive packet was meticulously assembled, not with angry letters, but with cold, irrefutable evidence. It included high-resolution copies of the deed and the official plat map, a narrative detailing the timeline of fines and harassment, and, crucially, a transcription of the police interaction, citing the specific case number and the officers finding that no trespassing had occurred. This package was delivered via certified mail to every sitting member of the HOA board, stripping away the enforcer's ability to manipulate the facts behind closed doors. The reaction from the board was a study in self-preservation. Faced with undeniable legal documentation that confirmed they had been fining and attempting to seize control of property outside their legal jurisdiction, the risk of a massive lawsuit became immediate and terrifyingly real. Their previous willingness to indulge the enforcer, viewing her as merely an overzealous volunteer, now looked like actionable negligence. The board's official response arrived 10 days later. It was a sterile, bureaucratic capitulation. The letter confirmed the boundaries of the lot were, in fact, excluded from the HOA's specific covenant regarding property maintenance and yard structures. More satisfyingly, the letter detailed the immediate and complete reversal of every single fine issued since the beginning of the dispute. The total sum was not insignificant, but the true victory was the symbolic return of the money, an acknowledgement that the homeowner had been right all along, and the association had been wrong. The protagonist's defiance had resulted in a complete financial and territorial victory. The financial clawback and the official boundary recognition meant the protagonist's property now enjoyed a unique, unassailable status. They were a de facto non-member, a tiny republic of autonomy nestled within the HOA state. The freedom was immediate and palpable. The small shed remained exactly where it was. The native plantings were allowed to flourish. No longer was every shadow or every dropped leaf a source of anxiety. The homeowner was finally free to enjoy the piece of land they had worked so hard to maintain. However, the consequences of this victory were deep and long-lasting, permanently reshaping the community's social fabric. The homeowner became an island of independence. They had won their peace, but they had also publicly shamed a significant number of neighbors who either served on the board or quietly supported the enforcer's obsession with absolute conformity. The cordial waves and superficial pleasantries that characterized suburban life dried up. There was no more casual neighborly banter. Instead, there was a strained, silent acknowledgement. The protagonist was now known as the person who challenged the system and won, a hero to a few, but a perpetual source of resentment to the many who valued rigid order over individual liberty. The long-term fate of the enforcer was the most satisfying part of the fallout. Her authority was entirely built on the perception of her unwavering dedication and correctness. Once proven wrong on the core issue of the property line, her influence simply evaporated. She attempted a few more petty attempts at enforcement against others, but her carefully crafted reputation had been shattered. When she tried to cite a different neighbor for a minor infraction, that neighbor simply referenced the infamous Not In HOA sign incident and dismissed her. She became irrelevant, a self-appointed official with no enforcement power, reduced to a disgruntled resident whose once immaculate lawn even seemed to suffer from her internal defeat. Eventually, she retreated completely from all community affairs, becoming a permanent fixture of silent, resentful defeat behind her own pristine front door. Her reign of petty tyranny was conclusively over. The ultimate impact of the sign was not just on one homeowner, but on the entire community. The board, chastened and fearful of further legal exposure, became remarkably passive. The aggressive, targeted enforcement ceased, replaced by a cautious, almost hands-off approach. The single act of legal defiance had broken the spirit of the association's overreach, reminding everyone that community rules must always bow to fundamental property rights. The protagonist's small, triangular lot became a constant, visible reminder that it is always possible to successfully push back against arbitrary power, provided one is willing to put in the time and research to find the necessary truth. The lesson was stark. Never underestimate the pettiness of misplaced authority, but never give up the fight when the law is truly on your side. The price of independence is the loss of easy friendship, but the reward is the unburdened right to own and define your own space. The question now remains: if a small sign can expose such a massive abuse of power, what other quiet tyrannies are thriving in the name of community uniformity in suburban America right now?